Well, we have 30 minutes to talk about what has been described by more than one person as the greatest single change in fuel oil or in fuel specifications and oil product specifications ever. So that's all, just 30 minutes. We can take care of that. So let's start first of all by introducing, or Matt, of course, Marianne did introduce, but Matt, why don't you talk about what your company does?
Sure, so my name is Matt Muenster. I work for a company called Breakthrough. We've actually recently chopped off the fuel. So a company you would have known of as Breakthroughfuel is now Breakthrough. But we build transportation energy models for shippers across modes of transportation. And so we concern ourselves with the cost consumption and emissions associated with any type of freight movement, whether it's on over-the-road truckload, on the rail, or even international container freight on steamships. And so that's what brings my interest particularly into this market event.
Scott?
DTN is a company that is involved in the weather space, in agriculture, and then my role with the company is in the downstream petroleum sector. DTN has the systems and essentially provides the backbone for wholesale transactions. So if an oil company wants to allow a customer to have access to product at the Atlanta terminal, then DTN systems are the ones that facilitate those kind of transactions and provides the authorizations for the customers to buy product and then handle the information flow for invoicing and all the details behind that.
So we're going to try to give a primer on IMO 2020 without getting too deep into the oil weeds. Believe me, we could sit up here for an hour or longer talking about it, but IMO 2020 is a regulation promulgated by the International Maritime Organization, which is affiliated with the United Nations. It was finalized back in 2016, I think, but it's been discussed forever. And the idea is to take the sulfur content in fuel oil, which is the fuel that powers ships, and cut it down. It used to be the Wild West. You could run up to like 4 or 5% sulfur. Then there was a regulation that cut it to 3.5%. IMO 2020 will cut it to 0.5%. What you have behind me is a roadmap, courtesy of a company called Baker O'Brien. I'd like to thank my friend Charles Kemp for this, talking about how you're going to get from about 3.2 million barrels of high sulfur. The HSB stands for high sulfur bunkers. Bunkers is another term for maritime fuel oil, to about 3.4 million barrels a day of low sulfur bunkers. So again, without going too deep in the weeds, there are a couple of categories that are of particular importance to this audience. The red is non-compliance. That's just ships that say, screw it, I'm not going to do this. 700,000 barrels a day, I have seen that figure over and over again. I am fully convinced that somebody came up with it and everybody is just repeating it, okay? But it's actually good. The higher that number, it's actually better for the trucking sector, and you'll understand why, we hope, by the end of this. 700,000 barrels a day in green are scrubbers. That's where you continue to burn high sulfur fuel oil. You put a piece of equipment known as a scrubber on the ship, and it basically takes the sulfur out in the emission process. The purple is extremely important. The purple is a new type of product called very low sulfur fuel oil. He's got it called here RFO, which is I'm not sure what R stands for, but this is very low sulfur fuel oil. This will be fuel oil that is compliant with the rule. It's important to this industry because one of the ways you get there is you blend in a product called vacuum gas oil. And when we take this down, we're going to put up a glossary behind me to show you all the terms. So that's going to pull on the diesel market. The other things are important too. The orange is where you change the mix of crudes that you run, so you get more fuels that are compliant, and you magically get up to 3.4 million barrels a day. I have no issue with this chart. I don't know. The people who've done this are extremely smart, but it's kind of a long-range model. And what it really doesn't model and really doesn't discuss, because I don't think anybody can model, is what happens in the short run. And there's something that's not on here that's important. And it's a product called, let's go to our glossary. It's a product called marine gas oil or marine diesel. And it is a diesel-like product. I shouldn't say diesel-like, it's a diesel product. that is now used to power ships. It tends to be more expensive, but the one thing about it is that the ship owners are comfortable with it. They've used it. They haven't used the VLSFO. So what I've heard at several discussions that I've been at is ship owners saying, well, you know, in the beginning, we're probably going to use marine gas oil because we know it. You know, we don't want to put this new VLSFO blend in our ship. It gets out in the middle of the ocean and it stalls. So the concern that I have that I think impacts this sector is that if there's a rush to marine gas oil, every one of those molecules in marine gas oil is a distillate. Diesel is a distillate. So essentially all of the pull from more marine gas oil comes from the same pool that produces diesel. If it comes out of VLSFO, yes, you've got some distillate in there through the blending of the VGO. I've got defined back here, but it's not 100% distillate molecules. And that is my big concern. So that kind of sets up the technical steps and the market relationships. So Matt, let me ask you, your business is to take your clients and get them through the fuel buying world. Are they nervous? Are you nervous? And what kind of steps are you taking in your various programs to adapt to what may be a new world?
Yeah, and so just to elaborate on what Breakthrough does just for a moment. So we build the reimbursement models. Most commonly, we're never actually dealing with physical fuel, but we're helping shippers understand what kind of costs they might expect as the market continues to evolve, and when dynamics like this regulation has come to be known as IMO2020 takes effect, what kind of price impact there might be. And so most of our clients, as many carriers of these clients are present here, are very heavily dependent on truckload. So there's limited things that they can do to really diversify their network away from diesel fuel, because we're a very diesel-dependent country to move our freight. Some clients may look to move more freight into the intermodal segment if the economics are right and it makes sense. But then, of course, service has to be thought about, and this is a longer-term plan and not something you're probably just going to shift to for a short period of time. In addition to that, clients are considering more and more fixed-price solutions. Might put in the same hedging, but thinking about locking in a price for a given period of time, particularly maybe second half of Q4 of this year into the first quarters of 2020, when we think the transition will really reach its kind of climax in terms of price point from maybe the market being more disruptive or disrupted during that period.
How many of your clients, do any of your clients use diesel hedging on the major exchanges, on the CME, for example, to protect their position, or really has the whole industry just gone to a fuel surcharge? And as we were talking back in the green room, nobody cares that they bleed as long as their competitors are bleeding at the same rate. Do you find a lot of hedging going on out there, or is that just something that does not go on?
Limited. So certainly not something that's used across all of our clients. Sometimes it's based on size. Sometimes it's based on what the client is most comfortable with. A lot of food and beverage companies that are heavily invested in hedging to ensure that their food costs are down, their raw material costs are down and remain down, are more comfortable than moving into hedging in the transportation industry.
Because they've got a whole trading team.
Yeah, they have the financial team stacked.
Let's talk a little bit about the numbers. This doesn't tell you anything about the rate of change, but there was a very good story reported by Petroleum Argus this morning. They had a deal in Asia on their first grade, and that settled against their particular specification for very low sulfur fuel oil. So in the story, they quoted the prices of these various fuels in metric ton, and I worked them down to price per gallon. So HSFO was $1.55 a gallon. And remember, HSFO is the one that, unless it's a scrubber or you're non-compliant, is going to go away. VLSFO, the kind of new blend being produced by a lot of companies that will have VGO blended into it, so it does have a distillate hit, was $2.14 a gallon. Marine gas oil was $1.97 a gallon. Now that kind of surprised me. I didn't really know that marine gas oil would have been trading less than the VLSFO. But obviously, if there's a rush to MGO and people are not buying the VLSFO, that relationship's going to change. But I just did want to give the audience an idea of where the prices are here, the price relationships are. Scott, you've been around the oil markets for a long time. Is there any precedent to what we're about to go through?
There's a couple of things to look at, and I know for most of the people in this room, we could, as you said, John, we could dig deep into, a lot of the aspects from the oil side of things. But how does it relate to the industry that's represented here? And there's a couple of things that we can look at. If you go back to 1993, any of you that may have been around then, we did a reduction in sulfur content for over-the-road diesel fuel in the U.S. And it was a significant step down in sulfur from 3,400 parts per million to 500 parts per million. There's a lot of talk about what was going to happen.
Let me just note that,
Sure.
And the content now is 15 parts per million. So you see how far we've come. So go ahead.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, now.
Because ultimately there was another reduction in 2006. So back in 1993 was this first major reduction in sulfur. A lot of talk about what's going to happen, a lot of anticipation about it. So two things that came out of that. Number one, was there a price shock that impacted the trucking industry? Yes, a huge price shock. It really, really drove up the price of diesel fuel from October through the winter, but then started to normalize when we got into the spring. So it was a very, very significant hit to costs for about 6 months out of the year. The second thing that came out of that, it was anticipated that there would be issues with lubricity because sulfur provides lubricity to fuel. So that was anticipated, but one of the things that came out of it was shortly after we started to get into the mandated season, then Cummins engines started to have problems and actually started to shut down. So your concern over MGO versus something that's known versus something that's not known in the industry, there's absolutely a precedent there because in 1993 into 94, it actually led to equipment failure. And then the second precedent, as you said, today we're at 15 parts per million. So from 2006 to 2007, we did another step down from 500 parts per million down to 15. There was another price hit. It caused diesel prices to move up, impacted everybody's operating costs quite significantly. On a longer range, though, that had a very, very material impact on diesel prices in this country. If you've been around long enough, you know that prior to 2006, generally speaking, diesel sold at a discount to gasoline. And unless you got into really a severe winter or something like that that was going to drive the price of distillates up, generally speaking, diesel was a cheaper fuel than gasoline. The market structurally changed because, well, one part of it was because of these sulfur regulations in 2006. So at one end of the spectrum, we had a hit to prices in 1993 that was relatively short-lived, absolutely impacted operating costs. In 2006, 2007, we had another hit to operating costs, but it materially changed the relationship of pricing forever. So,
and let's go back also to the 2006, 2007 and the price of diesel. If you charted the price of crude versus the price of diesel, diesel would have blown way out relative to crude. And if you remember, the all-time high price for crude oil on the NYMEX is, I believe it's July 3rd, 2008. And of course, diesel, the all-time high price for diesel was right about that, or maybe a week or so after. And the country was just gripped with this. Oh my God, we're going to have $200 oil. Well, what happened after that? Very quickly, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we had the Great Recession, and so all of these spreads collapsed. And I always wondered if it had been allowed to run, how far? Not just so much how far would the price of oil get, but how much? Not how much how the price of diesel would get relative to crude, but how high could crude get? But that little experiment just ended because of the Great Recession. So I think in some ways your model back to 93 is more relevant because that, as you said, allowed itself to play out.
Yep.
So, Matt, let me ask you, is the concern in the market, most, if not all, have a fuel surcharge. When the price spikes high, quickly. That's not good for trucking companies because the DOE price can't catch up on the way down. It's the inverse. Are they concerned that if you get a volatile market from IMO 2020, that you're just going to have these constant periods of, oh, I can't catch up. Oh, now we've got a windfall. I can't catch up. This is not a fun way to run a business.
Right, and maybe not continuous cycles, but certainly a market event over perhaps an extended period of time of a couple of quarters in which that margin between wholesale and the DOE index or the retail price will be compressed. And so then you do have a period of maybe a little bit more pain when it comes to fuel costs.
All right. Is the general system of fuel surcharges one that most people are happy with now, or do you hear talk, well, we should do it a little bit different, or is there a level of satisfaction?
We work with clients who do things differently. And so we build fuel management programs for shippers who do not continue to use the Department of Energy's weekly retail index. They're reimbursing prices that are moving daily. And so we're capturing all of the station and routing information necessary to reimburse more accurately and transparency to the cost across a lane and immediately account for the change in price that happens from these such events.
Right. I mean, I guess the DOE price has a couple of benefits. It's extremely transparent.
It is.
It's free. Everybody can see it. You know that your counterparties are all doing it. I know that we do have daily retail price in Sonar, so the information's out there. So I see your point that maybe the DOE price is maybe sort of antiquated, just coming out once a week in a rapidly moving market. Scott, what are the signs in the market we should be looking for that show that there's a squeeze developing or not a squeeze developing? Any kind of particular spreads that we should keep our eye on? The one market that I know, or markets that have started to move, are these crudes, some of which nobody really knew much about, that are very low in sulfur but are heavy, so they make a good fuel oil yield. And I mean, I've been in oil for years, and I've been reading about these grades, and I'm thinking, I never knew that grade of crude existed before.
Yeah, on the oil side of things, it's really a changing dynamic, and it continues to change. The oil industry I don't think has really found its new norm yet. I mean, clearly we've got the U.S. now that is become the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. A change in direction and a turnaround that is just absolutely astonishing, and the rate that happened. But the interesting thing is that the oil that we produce in the United States is not necessarily the oil that we want to consume, because over the years, the U.S. oil that's produced is very light and is very low in sulfur. And over the years, U.S. refiners have upgraded the refineries to be able to process a very heavy, very high sulfur content crude oil, and they did that because they could buy those oils at a greater discount. Well, now you throw in something like IMO 2020, and it changes the perspective on all of that, because now those very light oils that, even though we're producing them at home, they're not advantageous for the production of distillates, and there's going to be a greater demand for that. On the other end of the scale, you've got these very heavy crudes that are high in sulfur that we've become dependent on, but it's very difficult to remove the sulfur from them. And so as these regulations limit the amount of sulfur, it becomes increasingly difficult. And one of the things to understand also about removing sulfur at the refinery, it's not linear, it's exponential. So the difficulty of lowering the sulfur from, let's say, 500 parts per million to 15, it's exponentially more difficult to go from 15 parts per million to 10, or from 3% to 1.5% down to 1%. It becomes exponentially more difficult. So refiners are stuck trying to figure out all these different ways that they can do it, including now looking at different crudes. And so all of a sudden, you're right, there's crudes out of Chad, let's say, and out of Angola that are heavy crudes but are very low in sulfur. And generally, you don't get those two things together. And so I'm with you when I'm reading about these different grades of crude oil that are now out there getting talked about in the market. It's like, where did that come from?
Right, exactly. Let's talk about the political aspect of this. We know that the president has tweeted about oil prices very often. You know, the whispers are that, you know, well, maybe they pull, if it was a spike in prices, the U.S. would pull out of IMO 2020. There was a letter sent by several Republicans. I think it was bipartisan, I believe. It was not all Republicans. Group of senators to the president saying, please resist the urge to not get involved in this market, or resist the urge to get involved in this market. What are the political aspects of IMO 2020, Matt?
Yeah, so several, and I think the conversation about crude types factors into this conversation really well. So just a week ago, Monday, 14 senators sent a letter to President Trump to try to convince him to follow through with IMO 2020, and CC'd in that letter were Secretary of Energy Perry, Secretary of State Pompeo, because they see this again as another opportunity for the U.S. to continue to leverage its energy abundance, its energy dominance, growing energy dominance across oil and gas. And that talking about crude types, the U.S. offers crude oil that's low in sulfur content. And so maybe the density isn't something that refiners would all love because it's a lighter crude, but it is low in sulfur content. And so potentially has a role to play through this regulation, and exports may grow because of it. Also interesting that this is coming across at a time that a lot of heavy crudes are leaving the market via U.S. sanctions. So we've seen, of course, the Iran sanctions play out with waivers, and now the discontinued extension of those waivers. And now we have economic sanctions on Venezuela, another heavy crude producer. And so the U.S. light sweet crude or low sulfur crude is taking on even more relevance at a very interesting time.
And also the Saudis have cut back on their production significantly as part of their price support efforts through OPEC, and many of those are Saudi crudes, heavy crudes as well. Scott, if the U.S. were to pull out of IMO 2020, this is an international treaty. It covers ships that are going from port to port. Does it have much of an impact?
Well, based on the last 3 days, I don't think that the U.S. is going to have trade relations with China anymore. So we may see that maritime shipments are no longer a factor. I'm kidding. Yeah. Right? You know, I think part of the political issue here, and you know, whether we should get involved, should we be in it, should we not be in it, I think that ship is sort of sailed, especially when you look at the investments that a lot of refiners have made. So when we're talking about upgrades at a refinery to meet some of these specifications, the costs are absolutely staggering. To upgrade one refinery with hydrocracking capabilities and hydrotreating capabilities to do what needs to be done to create these fuels, we're literally talking about investments with B's in front of them, billions, 1.2, 1.4 billion dollars for one refinery to meet these requirements. And this is not something that you do in the span of 6 months. So those refiners that have been focused on meeting these regulations, they started this 4, 5, and 6 years ago with huge capital outlays to get to the point where we are now. And so any efforts politically to reverse this or have the United States pull out of it are going to be met with a lot of resistance, because you got folks that have sunk $1 billion into solving this problem. So there's absolutely problems if we were to back out of it from that standpoint of it. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, I'm a person that is concerned about the environment, is concerned about air quality. As painful as these things are, in the long run, it's the right thing to do.
You know, I mean, another aspect of this also is that these ships do, as I mentioned, transverse international oceans. The U.S. can pull out of IMO 2020, but some ship that's burning compliant fuel as it heads into a U.S. port is not going to dump a lot of high sulfur fuel oil into its tanks and then sail off to somewhere else where they have to be compliant. So this is where I think the impact of a U.S. withdrawal of IMO 2020 would have limited impact. Another aspect that I think is significant, I go back to that earlier chart showing 700,000 barrels a day of noncompliance. The insurance companies are going to be a factor here. And a ship that's non-compliant may find its insurance stripped, saying, okay, look, this is the rule, you're going to be compliant with this. So I think that 700,000 barrel a day figure might be high, and as I pointed out earlier, the higher non-compliance, that's actually better for the diesel market, because that's less of a pull. They're still using the high sulfur fuel oil. Finally, one other spread I want to mention, I pulled out some prices here and talked about the difference between high sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil and VLSFO. If that spread widens even further, now, it'll always be a spread, okay? But if it really, really widens, what happens is it starts to make the economics of putting that scrubber on the ship start to look good. I mean, scrubbers are also, they're a couple $100 million investment. I mean, it's expensive. But if the price of the dirty fuel that you can now put through the scrubber is that much cheaper, then maybe it works. So, we've got about 3 minutes to go. Predictions. Is it going to be nasty? Is this going to be a national issue? Is this going to have the trucking industry up in arms? I'm sure the fleets, I'm not saying can handle it better, but you think of an independent owner or operator suddenly seeing a couple of dollars a gallon tacked onto his diesel bill. This is very difficult for him or her to handle.
Yeah, so we're forecasting upward pressure into the marketplace beginning Q4 and moving into the first quarters of 2020. We're not in the portion of the forecasting market that is particularly showing dire circumstances. I think there gets to be a point, like we experienced last fall, where high prices cure high prices. It's a little bit unique of a circumstance in that we're focusing on a refined product and not just the price of oil that's causing the volatility and upward price pressure. But a lot of forecasts fall in between that 10 and 20% of an increase onto the price of diesel range. The International Energy Agency is one of the agencies that fall in that range. And so right now, we're seeing that as a reasonable expectation.
Scott, you've been through this before?
Yeah, here's my prediction. This thing will go somewhere between a non-event and utter market chaos. But rather than trying to predict that myself, here's what I would advise you, whether you're a trader or you follow the futures market or not. It's simple you can go online, you can go to CME Group, you can go to a lot of places and you can pull up what's called the forward curve, which shows you futures prices for ultra low sulfur diesel fuel going forward in time. That's going to be your best indicator. Look at the prices that are out there at December 19 and Jan 2020 and look at what those prices are doing. Because if it looks like it's going to hit the fan, you're going to have a lot of buying pressure in those months that are going to drive that price up. Right now, the difference in price between June and January is only about 2.5 to 3 cents, 1.5% or so.
Which in a normal market you would have.
Yeah. Right, because you've got a natural increase in price for the seasonal demand as you go into the winter. So right now you could look at that and say that the marketplace right now says, hey, we've got this under control. But if you see that spread starting to widen out significantly and it's not weather related, or the relationship between December 2019 and Jan 2020 starts to really widen out, that's your clue that the industry thinks that there's going to be an issue here, and maybe start looking at what you can do to mitigate your risk through futures positions. Perhaps.
And let me note, too, that even though the rule kicks in on January 1st, everybody in the market thinks if there's going to be a reaction, well, there's going to be activity, certainly by September, October, people clean out the tanks. The question is, are they going to put marine gas oil in? Are they going to put VLSFO in? One last technical point I do want to mention, the VLSFO product that I said needs to be blended with VGO, a lot of acronyms here. If that doesn't happen because people don't want to burn the VLSFO, then that VGO that was going to go in there can now go into marine gas oil. So it's not necessarily, one doesn't, there is a little trade-off between the two. So, but ultimately, this is a rule which you will take a fuel oil molecule and you will displace it with a diesel molecule. And I think that that's different than any other changes we've had in the past. Yeah. The kind of changes that you referred to, Scott, we're taking some nasty stuff out of existing fuels. The molecules stayed the same. The molecules don't stay the same here. And I think that ultimately is the difference. But anyway, we'll be looking at it at FreightWaves. I want to thank our guests today, Matt Muenster, Scott Sussich, and thank you, audience.